Welcome, friends of the Greasy Shop Rag. Today we're going to take a look at a Husqvarna 136 chainsaw. The customer complaint is that he wants new fuel lines and fuel filter. So looking into the tank, we find that he doesn't even have a filter on here. So I guess he's aware. Probably been doing his maintenance. This is an older saw and it's pretty clean. This wire mesh air filter on here, I think that's an aftermarket filter. I took it off and didn't see any Husqvarna part numbers or emblems on it, and it looks kind of coarse. Pretty sure it's aftermarket. Let's take a look inside the cylinder and make sure it's nice and clean and shiny. We're not going to waste any time putting lines into a saw that has a scored cylinder. A quick look, everything looks nice in there. So we'll put the spark plug back in for him. Torque down the specs. Alright, in order to replace the fuel line on here, I got to take the carburetor off. Yeah, I don't see any part numbers from Husqvarna or any Husqvarna emblems or nothing on there. So we have two 10mm nuts that hold this air filter holder in place. And then we have two Phillips head screws down at the base of the metal support plate for the carburetor. You'll see that in a second here. There's our throttle rod. We'll get that out of the way. Our choke lever just kind of sits in the back of the chassis there. So there's two studs that run through the carburetor. First they go through that support plate and then through the carburetor, then into the insulation wall. And there's, did I say they're 7mm? They're 7mm. And I use a swivel socket on here because you can't quite get straight shot at it, and using an open-end wrench takes forever. So there's the first bolt. You can see that it's kind of a tight fit in here. But you'll notice on the threaded ends of the bolts, both ends in this case, there's been Loctite used on there. And we're going to put it back together the same way. So here's our carb. And you'll notice how the line is routed behind that tab, but then it's in front of that support on the insulation wall. And where that hose runs in front of that support, it kind of gets pinched between that support and the rubber boot that goes over the adjustment screws. Look how bad this line is pinched off. I mean, that can't be good, can it? I mean, we're not talking about a 592 here or nothing like that. It's a 40cc saw, I guess. Somewhere in that range, 38 maybe. But it still needs fuel, right? So we're going to fix that. But before we do, this thing didn't have a fuel filter on it, so we're going to look inside the carb. And even though he didn't request us to look in here, it's probably a good thing we did, because look at all the wood in there. That's a lot. And if it was even running at all, it certainly didn't have much for power. Between that fuel line being pinched and that debris in that micro screen, this thing probably was working really hard to get fuel. Let's pull the cover off of the metering diaphragm and see what that looks like. We got our 4 screws out. Find a razor blade here and pop this thing off. It's showing signs of age. We know that the fuel pump diaphragm was working overtime trying to pull fuel. We're going to put a new kit in it. So the surface here where the fuel pump lives, we want to make sure that's nice and clean and smooth, because you do have those little flaps on the pump diaphragm here, and they have to seal against those holes. So it is important that that face of the carburetor is nice and clean and smooth. But we got our pump diaphragm and our gasket in place. Here's the gasket that goes between the carb and the insulation wall. And now we'll put our metering diaphragm gasket and diaphragm itself in place, along with the cover and the 4 screws. And then we'll just set this off to the side for now. So what I want to do is this line's going to get routed just like it was. That's the shortest route from the hole in the top of the tank to the point on the carburetor where it has to be attached. And in order to do that, in order to keep that same routing and not pinch the line, I'm going to have to grind a little bit of material out of the way. Right about in that spot right there. Now I could have chose to grind out that boot that goes over the carb adjustment screws, but it's kind of thin, and if I grind on that and go through it, I'm going to end up with a sharp spot, or it's going to rub against the adjustment screws. The fuel line would rub against the adjustment screws. We don't want that. This seems to work all right. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a fuel line in here that isn't so darn small. It's kind of like the next step up. But in order to get through the tank with a bigger fuel line, I'm going to need a bigger hole. So we just drill out the top of the tank a little bit. Use the next size bigger line. We're going to cut an angle on it and push it through. Now, you got to decide, do you want a real tight fit with that fuel hose so it doesn't leak? Or do you want a comfortable fit so it doesn't crush the line? And then maybe use some sealant on it so it doesn't leak. And I kind of landed in between those 2 points. So the line pulls through snug, and it probably wouldn't leak. We're going to put our filter on the end of the line here. Just got to relax the end of it a little bit so the filter pushes into it decent. So this product, Seal All, it's resistant to gasoline. It's like I think it's actually like a contact cement. But I've used this stuff, I've put it over wet, leaking tanks and it's sealed them. So I'm just going to put a dab of it on this fuel line and then pull the line down into the hole that I drilled. And if the line wasn't enough to seal it, that little bit of sealant will fix it. This is what we're trying to avoid. Look how that line was crushed being pulled through that small hole they had in the tank. And then look how small that passageway is. Is that enough to run the saw? Well, yeah, probably. Do I feel good about that the way it was? Not really. There's nothing wrong with what I just did here. And now this line won't get pinched. It should probably run out the remainder of its life with that line in there. Of course, the way the guy takes care of this thing. You know, it looks good. Maybe he just doesn't use it a lot. I'm not sure. Because he did bring it in without a filter on it, and he had been running it that way. So you notice we kind of jumped ahead. The carburetor's on here now. Well, you know, I got called away from the bench or forgot to hit the record button or something happened there. No big deal. The only thing you didn't see was that I did use Loctite on those two carb studs when I put it back together. We don't want those nuts falling off. Maybe getting jammed up in the throat of the carburetor. So we got his new air filter mounted in place. We'll get some fuel in here and we'll see if it's going to run. And if it does run, then that's all I'm going to have for you on the Husqvarna 136 chainsaw. The customer requested new fuel lines and a filter. Thanks for watching. Later.